Welcome to this video, which is part of the first online Tilted Conference 2023 towards intersectionality in language teacher education first steps. This was a conference held online on the 17th of November 2023. Tilted is a research group based at Moray House School of Education and Sport, University of Edinburgh. It sits within the Language, Interculturality and Literacy's thematic hub. The aim of this first online conference was twofold. One, to learn from researchers based in Scotland who have carried out work in the area of intersectionality, and two, to discuss the ways in which such work can help embed an intersectionality perspective in the area and practice of language teacher education. The conference featured 4 speakers. In this video, you will watch the presentation delivered by Dr. Geetha Marcus, Senior Lecturer in Teacher Education at Moray House School of Education and Sport, University of Edinburgh. The title of her talk was Inclusion, Diversity and Intersectional Activism, the Need for Transformation.
That's right. So I'm just going to start with a very short video, which I tend to show to my students who are mostly white student teachers who are training to become teachers out in primary schools. So I'm just going to play you this. There's a bit of a teaser. I'm going to stop it there because I think perhaps, it goes on for about 4.5 minutes. But I think from there, you possibly get a sense of the sense of urgency that basically belies the kind of message and the context with which I'm going to be giving my talk on intersectionality. So what I'm going to try and do here is share my screen, and you can all, I'm assuming, see my screen.
Yes.
Great, thank you. So you've just watched that video, but the objective of my contribution today is to reconsider what education is for, to understand the need for change in the 21st century global classroom, and to understand intersectionality and how it matters for the 21st century child. I'm just going to try and move my screen so that it's not in the way. Okay. So for those of you who are perhaps not familiar with Scottish education, I thought I would just give you a very quick run through of the current state of play. So according to the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, Britain is the 6th largest economy in the world based on GDP. We're supposed to be more child-centered than ever, and in theory, young people have rights and access to extensive welfare and health provision. There's legislation to educate, safeguard, and protect. There's legislation that requires adults to hear the views of young people. And the OECD, for example, in 2015 states that Scotland has a good education system and that the curriculum for excellence, which is the national curriculum we have, is a positive and important reform for the 21st century. However, the reality does not always match this rhetoric. The World Happiness Report is a publication of the Sustainable Development Solutions Network, and it's powered by the Gallup World Poll data. Finland has been ranked top for 6 years running, and the UK is currently at number 17. According to UNICEF, Britain was bottom of the list of 21 countries on measures of happiness, health, education, and poverty in all of the years running there. And the UK has been ranked 27 among 41 EU and OECD countries on children's health, academic, and social skill sets, falling behind countries like Slovakia and Romania. The UK has one of the most socially segregated school systems in the developed world. And the OECD evidence shows that segregated schools, where you have a heavy private school system and then a state school system, present children with at least 2 different perspectives of the world, and it affects their life chances. Scotland has taken steps towards addressing poverty differently by attempting to close the attainment gap. But evidence suggests that this is not working as planned. COVID-19 lays bare a system that is good, but not good enough for many of our children living in the 21st century. Might the system be broken? This is a question that's often asked anecdotally in meetings and staff rooms and in conferences that I go to. So what are our children up against globally? You saw that in the video of the exponential times that we live in, where knowledge that we're producing and passing on to children today may not even be relevant in 5 years' time. And let's just take a look at the case of poverty in Scotland from an intersectional point of view. Audre Lorde, African-American feminist, says that there's no such thing as a single issue struggle because we do not live single issue lives. And so if we look at poverty as usually put forward as a single issue and understood as a single issue, 1 in 4 children in Scotland live in poverty, but not all of these children are from low SIMD areas or are white working class. 68% of children live in poverty where someone in the household works. Single adults of all ages, and particularly single parent families, at 38% experience higher levels of poverty than all people. 29% of children with a disabled family member live in poverty. So you can see class, work, income, disability all start to have an influence on this so-called one topic called poverty. 32% of families with 3 or more children live in poverty. Poverty is higher among all Black and minority ethnic groups than among the majority white population. Current levels of BME child poverty still stand at 48%. Now, a lot of this information is taken from the Joseph Rowntree Foundation, and CPAG, which is the Child Poverty Action Group in Scotland. So this is a kind of a diagram of historically where we have come from in the Scottish education system, which is quite separate to the English education system. You know, in days gone by, in Victorian times, you know, you would talk about exclusion, where only certain types of children got to go to school. And after the war, the Second World War, we moved into integration, where girls were allowed, working class children were allowed, and so on and so forth. And there was this broad general education. It was offered to every child. And then after the 1992 Salamanca Statement in the United Nations, we got inclusion in principle, and the spirit of inclusion, where every child should be in a mainstream education system, no matter their need or ability or disability. And here we are now talking about transformation in the 21st century. And the question is, how do we get to that stage? So we've also we've gone from equality to the language of equity to now the language of justice, which fits in to the transformative idea. And then you've got exclusive justice, the redistributive justice, and now recognition for justice. The transformation, the idea of justice, and the recognition for justice are all firmly entrenched in the language of difference, different identities, different needs, and it all surrounds the idea of power, which brings me back to intersectionality. And here's a quote from Bell Hooks on education as the practice of freedom. She says, and this was in 1994. There's a crisis, serious crisis in education. Students often do not want to learn, and children do not want to students often do not want to learn, and teachers do not want to teach. More than ever before in the history of this nation, as in the United States, educators are compelled to confront the biases that have shaped teaching practices in our society and to create new ways of knowing, different strategies for the sharing of knowledge. We cannot address this crisis if progressive critical thinkers and social critics act as though teaching is not a subject worthy of regard. The classroom remains the most radical space of possibility. I celebrate teaching that embraces transgressions, a movement against and beyond boundaries. It is that movement that makes education the practice of freedom. Intersectionality, what does it look like in practice as practice? Because intersectionality was born out of African Americans, women's social movements linked to slavery, it is about thoughtful and committed action. Intersectionality is also not about defining groups as, according to race, class, gender, as victims, but recognizing inequalities within these groups and taking practical action to address power imbalances. It is a multidimensional approach that encourages us to see and to hear the child as a whole being from different social locations. So not just looking at a child who is poor, but looking at that child in terms of who is poor, in terms of their gender, in terms of their sexuality, their class, their race, and so on. So what does the UNICEF recommend? And so based on the Innocenti report card 16, the UNICEF calls for high-income countries to act on 3 fronts. 1, to consult children. 2, to connect policies for an integrated approach. And 3, to create strong foundations so that improvements for child well-being can be future-proofed, if possible. But here's the problem. I'm looking at the challenges faced by the Scottish education system from what Hooks calls the oppositional gaze, the oppositional gaze of Black female spectators, and it comes from her book, Black Looks, Race and Representation. The first thing to note is that intersectionality is political, but so is education. Nothing that is done within education systems is free from politics. Everything that we do, every idea, the curriculum, and pedagogical strategies are political. Hooks writes that because she remembered how she had dared to look at adults as a child, even though she was forbidden, that was her upbringing, she knew that slaves had looked to their slave owners. Power always coexisting with the possibility of resistance. And this looking as a form of resistance is key to the idea for transformation. It's a way of finding agency and control that goes beyond the people who actually hold the power. And it's not only will I stare, she says, I want my look to change reality. And this is from her book. So seeing through an intersectional feminist lens, otherwise known as the oppositional gaze, the challenges for the Scottish education system, in my view, sits within the global setting and how that interacts with the existing power structures and dynamics, which I argue have not changed for decades. We have a homogeneous education workforce, and that's problematic in terms of power dynamics and relations. We have a homogeneous teacher education workforce. Again, that's problematic in terms of power. We have a homogeneous leadership workforce, workforce across the board. We have a homogeneous research workforce. And again, that has implications for who produces the power, who reproduces the knowledge, and the people who reproduce and produce knowledge hold certain amount of power. The oppositional gaze, arguably, is missing. Policies and guidance tends to come by white male academics of a certain generation, many of whom are disconnected with the current reality of children's lives in schools, teachers' lives in schools, the pressures that they are under, actual practice that is going on in schools, support staff that are underpaid and overworked, and community organizations that support families. And so you get reports, guidances, churned out by the great and the good of Scottish educational thinking, like Donaldson, Chapman, and Priestley, and it's the same people who are coming up with these ideas. There's nothing wrong with that. However, how do you future-proof children's lives from one type of perspective? How is that going to work? Who gets the funding from research bodies? Certain types of people get funding from research bodies in the UK, and that again is an exercise of power and the control of knowledge production. Arguably, this creates replication rather than transformation. It's coming from the same people with the same perspectives, with the same identities, trying to affect changes in children's lives in a globally challenged 21st century world. Not only are our approaches not as integrated as they ought to be, but they also do not reflect diversity of thinking. The rhetoric and praxis is disconnected with reality, and increasingly so. Children's voices are still largely missing. Even though we say that we're doing it, it's not sufficient. And the oppositional gaze, again, I would argue, is missing. Starting point for intersectionality is not just power, but is difference, not diversity. Difference and diversity are two very different concepts in my view. It is about power, power relations, and power imbalances, and it concerns the way things work in people's lives, the way things work in terms of the exercise of power, rather than who people actually are. Recognizing how hierarchies of race, class, gender, disability, sexuality generate structural inequalities for particular groups, and in this case, I'm talking about children. And understanding these inequalities are not effectively captured through dominant models that focus on individuals on homogeneous groups, as in girls, boys, those living in low SIMD areas, terms like the working poor or the disabled, but they need to be seen as a whole. So which children count in the dominant practices and campaigns in education and schools? How do the dynamics of race, class, gender, sexuality, disability shape children's lives? how is the politics of recognition played out in children's lives so that we can transform their lives? How do these dynamics serve as resources for children? What kinds of alliances need to be built across different groups to effectively address children's intersectional inequalities? And if teachers can do anything at all, it is to point away from themselves and their world, but towards the world of children and the world that we live in, the global world, the world beyond Scotland. Here are some of the key themes and ideas that come from Bell Hooks in her book, Teaching to Transgress. These concepts of freedom, love, respect, problematizing the status quo, consciously disrupting complexities and nuances rather than binaries, black and white, the oppositional gaze, reframing knowledge, not getting rid of it, not throwing away what we know, but reframing it. Building a teaching community in a multicultural world, questioning, for example, why English is always the main language for instruction, and this concept of engaged pedagogy. So these are all ideas and themes and concepts that are pretty difficult to find in the curriculum, and pretty difficult to find in the way that we train our future teachers in the curriculum of initial teacher education programs. These concepts don't exist or exist in a very limited way. And so I've come to the end of my presentation, but these are just me sort of ideas and venting my frustrations at things not moving along in the speed that I wish for it to move.